Thanks very much indeed, Breed. You're very welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first of these 4 sessions going around the region from here to Derry next week, to Larne, to Dungannon in the end, looking at different aspects. Tonight we have 2 historians here, very distinguished Professor Henry Patterson, the well-known west of the Bann in particular, Dr. Russell Rees. And we're looking at the 2 islands, north and south, from partition into the post-war years. They're really the background to civil rights, and Dr. Rees is going to talk in particular about the links between British Labour and the Irish question, especially after 1945, when the Attlee government presided over the welfare revolution that had such an impact here, certainly in terms of education. Each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes. We try to keep an eye on time to give people a chance to raise points and questions at the end. And our first speaker is Professor Henry Patterson, Professor Emeritus of Irish Politics at the University of Ulster. Henry.
Right. Well, I've got the task of covering the South, the Free State, later the Irish Republic from the 20s to the 60s in 20 minutes, so hopefully we shall see if I can get it working. Start of the Irish Revolution very, very quickly. A conservative revolution, no social and economic dimension. Doesn't mean to say that there weren't socialists, trade union militants, feminists involved in the struggle to establish a republic after 1916, but in terms of the actual class content, in terms of its results, it was a conservative revolution. For one fundamental reason, that the British state, through the land legislation starting in the 1880s and through until the first decade of the 20th century, had effectively carried out a rural revolution, peacefully expropriating and compensating the landlord class and transferring the land to a class of large and medium-sized farmers. So the dominant cleavage, Ireland was a rural society, the dominant cleavage really, in the dominant class in the countryside were conservative, large and small farmers. The Catholic Church was, for reasons which most people will be familiar with, a dominant religious and cultural institution. The party system in the South, the dominant ideologies from the 20s through really, at least until the 1980s, some people would argue beyond, is dominated by the legacy of the Civil War, which split Sinn Féin, and to a lesser extent the IRA after the treaty in 1921. And Northern Ireland, the new state in Northern Ireland, the whole question of partition was one issue amongst a range of issues, which included what the anti-treaty acts regarded as the vestiges of British imperial domination of Ireland, the oath of allegiance, the Governor-General, and the fact that the British Navy continued to have access to certain ports in the new state. So you had the Civil War, which left a legacy of deep bitterness in Irish politics, certainly down into the 1960s. And it was the central cleavage of the Irish party system. The system itself been called two-and-a-half-party system because the was dominated by 2 parties with their roots in the pro- and anti-treaty sides in the Irish Civil War. The pro-treaty party, Cumann na Gael, which became Fine Gael in 1933, and the anti-treaty side, Sinn Féin, and the IRA. And Sinn Féin again splits again in 1926 with the formation of Fianna Fáil, which was going on to dominate Irish politics really through the next 60, 70 years. The Labour Party never really succeeded in establishing class as a central dimension of political cleavage in the system. It failed for various reasons, again, which if you want to discuss, we can discuss in the question, which failed to challenge the primacy of broadly national constitutional issues, at least down to the 60s. The dominant party throughout the period right up until the 1960s was Fianna Fáil, established by De Valera, Sean Lemass in 1926. It first went into government in 1932. Its success very much linked in personal terms to the figure of Eamon de Valera, who was the oldest surviving leader of the 1916 insurrection, was to depict itself as not just a political party but a broad national movement given over to the creation of a distinctive new society, culturally independent politically, and distinctive in economic and social terms as well. The first national aim, the first principle of Fianna Fáil's constitution was the ending of partition. De Valera kept a map showing the details of partition settlement in his office to show to visiting politicians and statesmen throughout his career. Fianna Fáil depicted its opponents, the Free State element, later Fine Gael, as West British and pro-unionist. And its prime cultural aim was to restore the Irish language to a prime position in the new state. It's just, I would dwell on this. It's just De Valera's reiteration in 1949, when quite a lot of people in his own cabinet, let alone the opposition, had doubts about the success of the policy of compulsory Gaelicisation of state and society, had doubts about whether it had been a success. He remained committed to it. Fianna Fáil depicted itself as a left-to-centre party, certainly in the 1920s and 1930s. And that depiction had, in Irish terms at least, maybe not in broader Western European terms, a real basis in reality. It did build up a new industrial sector behind tariff barriers in the 1930s. It created a new class of Irish industrialists. It expanded the size of the Irish working class through things like tariff barriers, through the controls on foreign investment in the 26-county economy. And the key figure in the development of this sort of autarkic protectionist society was the Minister of Industry and Commerce, Sean Lemass, who, as you'll see after a few more slides, was to play the central role in the demolition of this system from the late 1950s on. It also adapted pro-working class and pro-trade union legislation in the 1930s on issues like housing, pensions and unemployment benefits. So throughout its career, political career right down to the 60s and beyond, De Valera, for instance, talked about the degree to which he'd been influenced by the philosophy of James Connolly. Sean Lemass said, you don't need a Labour Party in the Republic. We are the Labour Party. And in terms of the voting patterns of the bulk of the Irish working class in the South, they continued to support Fianna Fáil right down into the 1960s and 1970s. At the centre of De Valera's political career were constitutional changes. I mean, his great achievement in terms of the development of the Irish state was to establish effective, independent political sovereignty for the 26 counties. And he did that through a series of reforms, culminating with abolition of the Governor-General and the Seanad, the upper house of the Southern Parliament, the way it had been established by the Free State government in the 1920s. He got rid of that in the 1930s. And at the high point of his constitutional change was the 1937 Constitution. And in terms of Northern Ireland, the key thing that annoyed and continued to perturb Ulster Unionists from 1937 on were the two articles which laid a territorial and a jurisdictional claim to Northern Ireland, to the 6 counties. the Constitutional in Article 44 also recognised the special position of the Catholic Church. There was a constitutional ban on there was a constitutional ban on divorce as well. I think the defining moment of his political career, and it's a defining moment in the history of the Irish state, was Irish neutrality during the Second World War. And the thing that really made this possible was the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1938, which returned the ports which Britain had continued to have access to after the treaty, returned those to full Irish control, and that enabled the Irish state to declare itself and neutral during the Second World War. Now, there's big debates about neutrality, but there's some things that are incontrovertible. One was that it was incredibly popular policy. It's secondly that it demonstrated De Valera prioritised sovereignty, the assertion of sovereignty, at least over 26 counties, over unity. It's questionable whether, as one historian, Brian Gervin, has argued, De Valera could have got the got the Free State into the war on Britain's side. I mean, Churchill offered him eventual Irish unity, or unity after the war was over, if he would forsake neutrality and join the Allied side against fascism, and he refused. Part of the problem for him would have been two things. First of all, a unity would have been dependent on the agreement of the government of Northern Ireland, so it didn't seem probably a very realistic proposition. And secondly, it would have divided Fianna Fáil down the middle, and could have possibly provoked a serious division within the broader sort of Republican family. De Valera, or Fianna Fáil, on the north. Now, De Valera's position, it did develop. In 1918, he talked about coercion, but in a private session to the Dáil in August 1921, he said that force could not be justified because it would not be successful. And in one sense, that remained his position really up until the 1940s. In 1939, he said he would be justified, or the Irish state would be justified in using force if he could do so effectively to, quote, rescue the people of Tyrone, Fermanagh, South Down, South Armagh and Derry City from the coercion they are suffering. And certainly the position of the nationalist and the Catholic population within Northern Ireland was an issue which he referred to rhetorically at various times through his political career. On the other hand, his practical attitude was effectively partitionist. When Northern nationalists asked him about the possibility of their elected representatives in Stormont or Westminster having a right of audience in the Dáil, he refused. He refused to consider the possibility of Fianna Fáil organising within Northern Ireland. So at one level you've got the rhetoric, and I don't doubt the sincerity of it, about the ending of partition being his first priority. But in reality, what happened after 1920 on his watch is the creation of an effectively sovereign Irish state. And he achieves a degree of success in that project. Neutrality is, from the Irish point of view, the establishment of sovereignty. In economic and social terms, there is the Irish economy does, in the 1930s, develop in terms of industrial development, and economically and socially in terms of the situation of the Irish working class. On force, by the end of the 40s, he had basically given it up as an option. And he, in fact, before he retires in the 1950s, he basically comes round to the position of saying, in private, more not publicly, that the only way we'll get unity on the island is if the two main traditions, symbolised by himself, and unionism, symbolised by that time by Basil Brooke, Lord Brooke, could work out some form of internal accommodation. And he said, up until then, his argument, and its argument's still strong within Fianna Fáil, sections of Fianna Fáil, and the broader Republican movement throughout the period and beyond De Valera, beyond the 1960s, is that the source of partition is England, is Britain. And to get rid of partition, you've got to change the British position. De Valera, for most of his career, clove to that position. We've got to get London to change. But there is evidence by the 40s and in the 50s that he's shifting away towards a position, well, if we could improve relations north and south, that would be a more effective manner, perhaps the only manner which we'll ever achieve reunification. Fianna Fáil lost power in the period between 1932 and, say, the outbreak of the Civil Rights Movement, 1968-69. Fianna Fáil was only out of power for 6 years, and both times to all-party coalition. And in 1948, that coalition, under John A. Costello, declared a republic. And on the basis of that, the British government passed the Ireland Act, which strengthened the position of Unionists in the North by saying Northern Ireland could not cease to be part of the United Kingdom without the support of the Stormont Parliament. And in response to that, you get a national, all-party anti-partition campaign launched in the South, and the Taoiseach at the time, John A. Costello, calls a special conference in the Mansion House in Dublin to collect funds. Brooke, the Northern Ireland Prime Minister, called a general election to demonstrate Unionist unity against the new Irish Republic in 1949, and the decision of the Mansion House Committee is to have a churchgate collection outside all, not just across all churches, outside all churches in the Republic, to raise funds for nationalist candidates in the South. It comes known as the Chapelgate election, and as the Guardian correspondent said in 1949, what the Synoviev letter did for the English Tories in 1924, the anti-partition fund, can be made to do for the Orange Men in 1949. And the effect in Northern Ireland was to galvanise the Unionist population, Protestant population, behind the Ulster Unionists and decimate the Northern Ireland Labour Party in the election. Unionist attitudes to the South they saw Articles 2 and 3 as part of what they saw as an irredentist, aggressive claim. They emphasised the confessional nature of the Irish state, the special position of the Catholic Church, the ban on divorce and contraception, and the mother and child debacle in 1949-1950, when a provision for state-supported health care for women and children, which Noel Brown, who was a minister in the then coalition government in the South, wanted to introduce, was vetoed by the Catholic Church. There's the Ne Temere decree, papal decree of 1908 about mixed marriages, saying that children have to be brought up Catholics, compulsory Irish. So Unionist, basically there's a Cold War between both states from the 20s till the end of the 50s. I'll just skip to the last slide because it's about 15 minutes. I'm coming up, yeah. So essentially, what happens and what is quite an important prelude to the events of 68 and 69 is De Valera retires in 1959 and he's replaced as leader of Fianna Fáil and Taoiseach by Sean Lemass. The thing about Lemass compared to De Valera is he's always been focused on economic and social issues more than cultural and constitutional issues. He wants to forsake the protectionist policies of the past. So there's a new program for economic expansion launched in 1958, which is based on opening up the Irish economy to foreign capital, getting rid of tariffs and preparing the way for a free trade agreement with the UK and eventually joint membership of the EEC, European Economic Community, along with Britain. He hoped for it to occur in the early to mid-1960s. It didn't happen until 1972. But Lemass's vision of partition and ending partition is dominated by a sort of economic imperative. He thinks if we can get better cooperation economically between North and South, if we get rid of tariff barriers between Northern Ireland and the Republic, between the Republic and the United Kingdom, this will, in the longer term, create the conditions for a rapprochement between North and South. And the culmination of this is that because of his changes, it becomes possible for the new Northern Ireland Prime Minister who replaces Brookburgh basically refused all Lemass's overtures from 1959 until 1963. Lemass said, why can't we meet to talk about economic and social cooperation, tourism, industrial development? And Brookburgh's response is, until you get rid of Articles 2 and 3 and recognise there's nothing doing. O'Neill changed. One of the things that O'Neill tries to do to modernise the, Northern Ireland to try and solidify and to attract not Catholic support for unionism per se, but Catholic acquiescence in the union, is invite Lemass to Northern Ireland in January 1965. And that is a key development because it, in a way, it held the potential for that sort of gradual coming together and practical functional cooperation, which both Lemass and O'Neill thought would, at least in the short to medium term, improve relations. Lemass hoped for something more profound, but it held the potential, which in a way you could say civil rights, the onset of the civil rights movement put an end to. I'd say the fundamental weakness of Lemass is he reflects the fact that the separation between the two systems and the lack of links between Northern nationalists and the Southern state. For instance, in 1960, the Department of External Affairs, the Department of Foreign Affairs, hadn't sent officials north to talk to the Northern nationalists for 4 years. When Lemass himself had little time for Northern nationalists, he thought they were too like Northern Unionists. They were too irascible, too inflexible. He said once, after he retired, when I deal with Northern nationalists, what I see is people who, by unity, in the end, if partition was ended tomorrow, it would be an occasion to put their foot on the throat of the Orangemen. In other words, he's saying that nationalism is a sort of inverse, is a perhaps understandable reaction to unionist supremacism, but he found Northern nationalists too harsh and too inflexible. So he totally ignored the issue of discrimination. He wasn't interested in it. He thought that's the old things that we used to bang on about under De Valera. I'm going to go and do a deal at the top. And of course, if the British state is ignoring issues like discrimination and the Irish state, the Irish Taoiseach is ignoring it as well, you're creating the conditions, you're creating a problem. So the modernisation or rapprochement is relatively superficial. So I'll just end on one thing he said in 1968, he left office, but when the civil rights movement was getting off the ground, he said, 3 wet days and it'll be over. So I'll leave you with that.